You've probably heard the story that the Bible was decided in a secret meeting at the Council of Nicaea, where Emperor Constantine gathered bishops to vote on which books would stay and which would be rejected. It sounds dramatic, full of politics and conspiracy, and it has been made popular by movies and novels. But history tells a very different story. The Bible was not created at Nicaea. Its formation was a long process, and its true confirmation happened later in forgotten councils that met in a city in North Africa called Carthage. So where did this Nicaea myth even come from? It's a powerful story, and people love a good conspiracy. It suggests the Bible wasn't a collection of sacred writings that grew over time, but a political document engineered by an emperor. The idea first appears in a questionable Greek manuscript from the late 9th century, more than 500 years after the council itself. It tells a dramatic tale of bishops placing rival books on an altar and praying for the true ones to miraculously rise to the top. Later, Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire picked up the story to mock church history, and from there it slowly slipped into popular culture. But if it's just not true, so what really happened at the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD? The answer is simpler and, theologically, way more important. Emperor Constantine called the council for one main reason: to stop the church from tearing itself apart over a huge theological fight. The central issue wasn't about books. It was about the nature of Jesus Christ. A popular and very influential priest from Alexandria named Arius was teaching that Jesus, the Son of God, wasn't eternal. He argued that Jesus was a created being, the first and greatest of God's creations, sure, but not divine in the same way God the Father is. This idea, called Arianism, was causing a massive rift in the church. On the other side was a bishop also from Alexandria named Athanasius, who argued that the Son was co-eternal and made of the same stuff as the Father. The debate got so heated it threatened the unity of Constantine's empire, so he called the council to settle things. After a ton of debate, the bishops overwhelmingly rejected Arianism. They wrote a statement of faith we now call the Nicene Creed, which you can still hear in churches all over the world. It includes the killer line clarifying that Jesus was begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father. That was the main event. The council also set a standard date for celebrating Easter and handled some other church discipline issues. And this is the part most people never hear. The Bible was never discussed at Nicaea. No surviving record from that council mentions a debate, a vote, or even a conversation about which books belonged in Scripture. Not Athanasius. Not the historian Eusebius, who was present in the council, mentions it. Nothing. The canon of the Bible simply was not on the agenda. So if Nicaea didn't create the Bible, where did it come from? To get that, we have to go back further, to the first few centuries after Jesus' death. Think of this as the Wild West era for Christian writings. There was no single book called the Bible. Instead, you had dozens, maybe hundreds, of texts floating around the scattered Christian communities. You had the four Gospels we already know: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You had the letters from the Apostle Paul. These texts formed a core that was widely accepted pretty early on. But alongside them, you had a ton of other writings. There was the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, and other letters, apocalypses, and teachings like the Shepherd of Hermas and the Didache. Different churches in different parts of the Roman Empire, from Antioch to Rome, Alexandria to Gaul, used slightly different sets of these texts. The edges of what they considered scripture were fuzzy. At first, this wasn't a huge deal, but as the 2nd and 3rd centuries passed, this chaotic library started to become a real problem. New theological movements popped up, especially Gnosticism. The Gnostics wrote a flood of their own texts, claiming they had secret knowledge from Jesus. These books often pushed a totally different version of Christianity, one where the physical world was evil and Jesus was a spirit who only looked like a man. These ideas flew in the face of the core teachings passed down by the apostles. This created a crisis. How could an average person know if the text they were reading was a genuine apostolic account or a later forgery meant to trick them? Church leaders realized they needed to draw a clear line. They needed a standard to identify which books truly carried the weight of divine inspiration and apostolic authority. They needed a canon, from the Greek word for a measuring rod, a standard to measure all other teachings against. The formation of the Bible wasn't a single event. It was a slow, organic process of discernment that took hundreds of years. It was less like a meeting and more like a giant filter as texts were passed down, studied, and used in worship across generations. Over time, the early church leaders and their communities started to use a set of criteria to figure out which books measured up. There were 4 main tests a book had to pass. First, apostolic origin. Was it written by an apostle or someone in their direct circle? Matthew and John were believed to be apostles themselves. Mark was known as a close companion of Peter, and Luke was a companion of Paul. That direct link to eyewitnesses was the single most important factor. Second, widespread use. Was the book being read and shared by churches everywhere? Books like Paul's letter to the Romans or the Gospel of John were used in services from Spain to Syria, showing a universal consensus. A book only used by one small community probably wasn't going to make the cut. Third, doctrinal consistency. Did the book's message actually line up with the core faith handed down from the apostles? This is where a lot of Gnostic texts got tossed out. Their teachings were just too different from the accepted tradition. The books had to tell one consistent story. And fourth, divine qualities. This one is more subjective, but early Christians believed that truly inspired texts had a spiritual power that set them apart. They spoke to people in a way that merely human writings didn't. You can see this filtering process happening long before Nicaea. For example, a document from the late 2nd century called the Muratorian Fragment lists most of the New Testament books we use today, showing that a core canon was already forming nearly 150 years earlier. And Athanasius, our hero from the Nicaea debate, wrote a letter in 367 AD that lists the exact same 27 New Testament books we recognize today, calling them the fountains of salvation. This finally brings us to North Africa at the end of the 4th century. Athanasius's letter was a big deal, but it was still just the opinion of one very respected bishop. The next and most crucial step involved a series of local church meetings. This is where the story moves from the famous Nicaea to the forgotten city of Carthage. In 393 AD, a council of bishops met in the nearby city of Hippo. The famous theologian Augustine of Hippo was there. At this synod of Hippo, the bishops drew up a formal list of the books of the Old and New Testaments that they agreed should be read in churches. Their New Testament list had the same 27 books we use today, from Matthew to Revelation. Just a few years later, in 397 AD, another larger council was held in the major city of Carthage. This Council of Carthage officially ratified the decision from Hippo. They issued a rule stating that, besides the canonical scriptures, nothing shall be read in church under the name of divine scriptures. And then they listed the books. The New Testament list was identical to the one from Hippo, and it's the same one Christians use today. Now, here's the key thing to understand about these councils. They didn't see themselves as creating the Bible or deciding which books were holy. The vast majority of the books on their list had already been accepted for centuries. Their job was one of confirmation, not creation. They were officially recognizing the consensus that had already been built over 300 years of faith and worship. They were simply drawing a clear line in the sand to protect their congregations from the flood of bogus texts. So the next time you hear someone say the Bible was invented by Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea, you can confidently tell them that's a myth. The Bible wasn't forged in a single smoke-filled room of political drama. Instead, its New Testament canon grew out of a long and messy process within the early Christian communities. It was a centuries-long journey of writing, sharing, reading, and discerning. And that journey reached its climax not in the imperial glitter of Nicaea, but in the practical and now almost forgotten councils of Hippo and Carthage. Understanding this real history clears away the myths and modern conspiracies and reveals something far more powerful. The story of how a scattered collection of sacred writings, preserved by ordinary believers across generations, slowly became the most influential book in human history. Here on Bible Stories Gazette, this is the kind of journey we uncover. The forgotten paths that shaped the faith and changed the world. Thank you for visiting our channel. See you in the next video.